Ionic compounds are a major category in chemistry. In fact, almost all compounds you're going to come across are most likely going to be ionic compounds. Now, what is an ionic compound? Well, it's exactly what the name says. It's a compound made up of ions. And for the most part, all ionic compounds, I shouldn't say all ionic compounds, but most ionic compounds have a metal in their formula. If you come across a compound that has a metal in the formula, most likely it's going to be an ionic compound. Now, there are some exceptions, but what is an ion? So let's briefly review an ion. An ion is something that has lost or gained an electron. Remember, an atom is composed of a nucleus that has protons and neutrons, and then surrounding that nucleus are electrons. Those electrons are what describe all of chemistry. We only really focus on electrons in chemistry. And so atoms can either gain electrons or they will lose electrons to basically form bonds. Those bonds are what we call an electrostatic attraction, meaning that we have a positive charge and a negative charge. How do we get a positive charge? We get a positive charge whenever an electron leaves an atom. If an electron leaves an atom, there's going to be more positive charge in the nucleus. How do we get a negative charge? Well, we get a negative charge by an atom gaining an electron, gaining a negative charge. And so that positive and a negative will be attracted to each other to form what we call an ionic bond. Metals will lose an electron. They will become positively charged. Nonmetals will gain those electrons to become negatively charged. And so those ions will get attracted to each other to form an ionic compound. Now, a very popular and common ionic compound that you're most familiar with is sodium chloride, which is just simple table salt. Sodium chloride is made up of a sodium atom, or I should say a sodium ion. So we have a sodium atom which has lost an electron, which makes it a positively charged ion, and chlorine, which has gained an electron, which is negatively charged. Now, this positive and negative will come together and make an ionic bond. Now, compounds that form ionic bonds do not form individual molecules. Instead, what happens is these ions get surrounded by other species that are oppositely charged. So this sodium ion is going to be completely surrounded by chloride ions, and the chloride ions are going to be completely surrounded by sodium ions. And so that surrounding, that structure that forms is what we would call a crystal lattice structure. And so whenever we have an ionic compound, it doesn't form individual molecules, it forms a crystal structure. As such, we never say molecules for ionic compounds. Instead, we usually say formula units, meaning it's a unit of these cations and anions that have formed. And as a brief review, cation is a metal ion, something that has lost an electron. An anion is something that has gained an electron, which is usually a nonmetal. What are some properties of ionic compounds? Ionic compounds are usually solid at room temperature. They have extremely high melting points, meaning that it takes a lot of energy to separate out those ions to go into a liquid or molten state. It's very rare to find ionic compounds in a gas phase, so they usually don't have boiling points. They will also dissolve in water, but not all ionic compounds dissolve in water. Some of them do, some of them don't, and that the reasoning behind that goes above and beyond this class. Now, also, when ionic compounds become a molten, meaning they're in a liquid state, they are what we call electrolytes. An electrolyte is something that can conduct electricity. And so in the molten state, when an ionic compound is in a liquid state, it can conduct electricity. It cannot conduct electricity when it's in a solid state. And so let's think about that for a second. Electrons are needed to move around for it to conduct electricity. In a solid, those electrons are pretty much localized around those nuclei, and so those electrons are not going to move around much, so the conductivity for a solid ionic compound is extremely low. But whenever we're in a molten state, those atoms are now moving around more freely, and those electrons are even more on the move, let's say. And so conductivity definitely increases in the molten state. Also, when ionic compounds dissolve in a solution, or let's say water or any other substance, it will also form an electrolyte. And that's because when it dissolves, those ions separate, and now we have a charged species that is able to move around, and therefore it can conduct electricity. So properties of ionic compounds are they're solid at room temperature, they have extremely high melting points, many of them will dissolve in water, and when they're molten they conduct electricity, and when they're dissolved in water they will also conduct electricity.